Lee Cassanelli, and I'm a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. I've been teaching there for 35 years now, and teach African history and world history with a specialization in Northeast Africa, including Somalia. I'm also currently the director of the Africa Center at the University of Pennsylvania. The Africa Center coordinates all university-related activities connected with Africa. We do study abroad programs, we teach African languages, and we also serve as a resource to the wider community in the Philadelphia area interested to know anything about Africa.
Can you just explain to us, for those who don't know anything about Somali studies, first of all, terminology. What does Somali studies exactly mean? What does that entail?
Well, that's a good question. We started off trying to get a name. First of all, I should mention that the association, the Somali Studies International Association, was founded in 1978. It was at a meeting, an African Studies Association meeting. African Studies Association is the large North American organization for all Africanists in any field. But there were a small group of us who said that, who had an interest in Somalia, and we said there's no association. There's an Ethiopian Studies Association, there's a West African Studies Association, Mande Speaking People Study Association, but nothing on Somalia. And so we said maybe we should start an association. And initially we said let's call it the International Association of Somali Studies, or International Somali Studies Association. But you know that translated, if you put the letters, as ISA. And we said, oh, we can't have a tribal name, so we didn't want to do that. So then we made it. We decided it was should be Somali Studies International Association, SSIA. And it was there were about 8 or 10 of us who met at this conference and decided to create just a nonprofit chartered group called the Somali Studies International Association. And the real spirit behind it was a Dr. Hussein Adam, Tanzania. Hussein Tanzania, he's called. He is currently still teaching, I think he's not quite retired yet, at Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. And he was he was the person who really said, we really have to do this, but we have to create an association that has staying power, that doesn't just come and go for political reasons. And so among the principles of the association, the founding principles were that the SSIA would be a non-political scholarly organization, and its goals would be to encourage research on Somalia and its neighbors in all fields, humanities, social sciences, natural sciences. That it would serve, that another goal was to encourage international cooperation among scholars and institutions that were interested in Somalia. A third goal was to have try to host an international meeting periodically. It's turned out to be just about every 3 years we've managed to have an International Studies Association meeting, but also to encourage smaller regional and local meetings concerned with Somali studies. And the fourth goal was to be to provide information to the communities in which we all lived about Somalia and the Horn. Because back in those days, you know, Somalia was not very well known. A lot of people knew about Ethiopia, and there was a big and very active and very old Ethiopian Studies Association. So the idea was, to some extent, to create a little bit of a counterbalance and to emphasize Somali studies. And since that founding, you know, we've met, as they say, every 3 years, with a few exceptions, on 3 different continents. We've met in Africa, we met in Mogadishu twice. We've met before the collapse of the state. The first Congress was in 1979. The last Congress held in Mogadishu was in 1989, just a year or so before the government collapsed. Not all members of the association attended that meeting, for reasons we can talk about if you'd like. We met once in Somaliland in 2001, in Hargeisa. We've met in Djibouti, so those were the Africa venues. We've also had triennial meetings in Rome, in Berlin, in Hamburg, Germany, in Finland, in Denmark, and now Norway. So we've been getting around. So we're still waiting for England. We're still waiting for the UK to become a host.
Yeah.
Oh, we had it also once. We had it in Canada. I don't want to forget Canada, our neighbors, and in the United States one time as well.
In terms of various relative subjects that you mentioned that is covered in Somali studies, at the onset, have you guys decided in terms, because you did say academic research, have you guys then decided what that entails in terms of research and subject?
Well, originally, the original founding group were all, I think we were all academics, all people teaching in universities, institutions of higher education. And I think our thought was that the association would promote study and exchange of ideas on questions dealing with language and linguistics, which is, of course, oral poetry, history, anthropology, maybe economics, politics, international relations. And we hoped also to encourage interest in things like studying of Somali youth, or aging, issues of sociological issues, or migration, or issues of refugees, and so on. And in fact, initially, most of the Congress was, if you look at the proceedings from the first two Congresses or so, they were all really scholarly presentations. Although there were always organizations with an interest in development in Somalia, others that were interested in maybe in women's empowerment. There were people interested in forestry or mineral production, and we often had papers on these topics. So they were kind of more policy-oriented, transportation and so on. As time has gone on, the countries that have agreed to host the SSIA have been countries that have tended to either be hosts for lots of refugees who have come from the Horn of Africa since the Civil War, or they're countries which have some kind of interest in strategic questions or security questions in the Horn of Africa. And so therefore the Congresses have reflected the interests to some extent of the host institutions, even as they continue with the same traditional thematic topics. So while we have always something on Somali poetry, and there's always something on Somalia's role in the international relations and so on, we've had a lot more discussions of diaspora organizations, the role of diaspora in development, as you saw at this Congress here, questions that have to do with language in the diaspora, what's happening to the Somali language, and so on. And in recent Congresses, we've had a lot of, there's been quite a bit of interest in governance issues, because that's been on the agenda of everybody concerned with Somalia. Yeah.
And you mentioned the first day when you was talking about the history of Somali studies, that one of the Congress was held in Mogadishu in '83, and I think...
No, 89. Well, the first one was 79.
Yeah.
That was the founding Congress. It was small, but I think it was Siad Barre's attempt to open up Somalia to the world, and so he wanted to host it there.
Okay.
The second, after 2 years, after two meetings in Europe, we returned. The organization was re-invited to come back to Mogadishu in 1989. Do you want me to that story? Shall I?
Yeah. I'm getting to the conflict where you were just mentioning that.
Right.
Maybe if you could enlighten us.
Sure. 1989. Lots of things were going on globally, and the Cold War was still on, but it was coming to an end. The Congress was scheduled, I think, for June. I wasn't able to go because of a family wedding, but there were some of my colleagues in the Somali Studies Association who said we cannot accept Somalia's invitation to go and have our Congress there, because it will give legitimacy and it will encourage the Siad Barre government to continue in its at that time. It had just conducted air attacks in the north against Hargeisa, and there were all sorts of accusations of human rights violations. I think the United States finally, after many years of supporting the government, had pulled back some of its aid. Most Western countries did that. And so the idea was, would an international Congress, even though the Somali Studies Association, International Association, is not a world widely recognized or well-known organization, to have a meeting there would maybe give a little bit of credibility to the regime. And so there are several colleagues, very well-respected academics, who said, we're not going to go. We're going to, as a sign of protest, we're going to stay away, so that Siad Barre's regime doesn't have the privilege of having the Congress attended by lots of well-known people. Others said, no, wait, that's a mistake, because there are many young people at the Somali University, National University, and the Academy who are just hungry for exchange of ideas with outside scholars because they've been hearing a lot of, government propaganda and this and that. And because the government had invited us, they said, well, this is a chance now to kind of give intellectual nourishment to some of these young people and to get their ideas and to encourage them to do research while they were there in the country. So it was both options were quite legitimate and deeply thought out by people, but there was a disagreement, and I'd say that the Congress in '89 was attended by probably not as many as had been at the previous ones, but there were still a good number of those who attended. Now, a year later, the Somali government was gone or was on the way out, and so we never returned to Mogadishu again. After that time, all of the subsequent Congresses were held in the diaspora, except for I think it was 2007, when it was held in Djibouti, and that's the time we returned to the Horn.
Now,
and Hargeisa in 2001.
Hargeisa,
yeah.
And looking at the issues that you as scholars and academics face in terms of what you mentioned earlier, being Gurti and elders and that sort of things.
Right.
And the philosophy of reviving things lies in engaging the new generation. Has that been any problem in terms of the past? Because now I know that in Somalia there is quite some interest in the politics of Somalia. All around the world,
right.
Youth are again interested in Somalia itself.
Right.
And whereas 20 years ago we still had that phase of refugee and where can I eat and sleep?
Right.
But now it's more like academic folks. Is that something new interest that might be revived?
I try to. Yeah, I think I've been to almost every Congress. I've missed maybe 2 over the years. But I do keep in touch with everyone in Somali Studies, and I was very heartened by the enthusiastic young people at this Congress, many of whom admitted that they didn't want to have anything to do with Somalia when they were very young, because of the image that Somalis were just refugees or warlords or criminals or pirates or whatever. And so now, though, they're beginning, as they grow older, and begin to learn that not everything we read about Somalia, that's not the whole story, in other words. And so bringing younger people into the association has always been one of our goals, or to encourage younger people to take up and continue the research. It's been much harder, of course, to do research because it was very difficult to go and do field work anywhere in the country during the 20 years of conflict. But now things may be improving, and so we're glad to see these young people. But they themselves have lots of issues that are related to their own diaspora identity and the attitudes of their parents, sometimes, or their grandparents, which still kind of try to look for blame on other clans or this or that, and so that's something that the young folks will work out on their own. I think as elders, our job is to remind young Somali scholars that there's a very rich tradition of scholarship, that Somalia, that we remembered when we were first doing research, was really a place where people of different clans, different persuasions were able to mix and mingle. There wasn't, everyone was Muslim, and people talked about religion, but they didn't fight about it. And these were the days, and I think for young people, they don't have that memory of Mogadishu being a place you could go out and have tea at night and walk peacefully up and down the streets. So that's part of our role, is to recall those days and to encourage a really serious scholarship, not just political or polemical arguments about who's right and who's wrong, but to do research. We need a lot of good research now on how Somali society is changing, how Walla banking has really affected investments and business directions, and what's happening to different generations in Somalia, and so on. And is there indigenous knowledge about environment or about medicine or so on that can be used in the modern sector? So I'm hoping that it will continue. And as I think I mentioned it during our Congress here, every year, every Congress, every third year or so, there's some new topics or new themes that people bring up. This last one here, we had a big discussion of human rights violations, and whether the new government or some new government with international support should be going after or identifying and prosecuting war criminals, and would that be good or bad for the future of the country, because there's been a big debate. That's a big and important issue. I think that's an important set of questions. And then there's also the issue of minorities, which, as someone mentioned, the rights of minorities were increased under Siad Barre's regime, but it also, after the collapse of that regime, a lot of people have gone back to old attitudes. So these are important issues, and I'm pleased to see that the Congress has taken them, confronted them, and they do that all the time.
Okay, come back. Just what would you say to young Somalis watching you, listening to you at the moment, in terms of, this is sort of a personal question, I think.
Sure.
Looking at, you must have come across a lot of concept of Artan or Ajnabi and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What could you tell them that makes them understand what makes a foreigner, looking into the anthropology side of another totally alien culture to them, that sort of thing?
Yeah. I'm never one who philosophizes too much about why I do what I do, but I've learned so much. I mean, I think when you spend as much time as I have, and I wasn't intending to study and stay with Somali studies all my life, but I got interested early on in it. I did research when I was a graduate student. I was only, I think 24 or 5 years old when I first went to Somalia, and I've been going back, as much as I can ever since then. But my original goal was to just do something that people hadn't done much work on. I read Italian, I read English, and French, and I read a lot of travel accounts, and then I read ethnographic accounts, and I did actual work and collected oral traditions as a young man. But because Somalia always had something interesting going on there, whether it was Siad Barre's government, Somali socialism, whether it was the Ogaden War in 1977, then the collapse of the state, and then the war on terror, and then the pirates, and so on. There's always been interest, and people have asked me, well, you know Somalia well, you've been there. So they've kind of come to me, and it keeps me kind of involved in Somalia, even though at the University of Pennsylvania I'm doing other things. But for young people, I learn a lot because they're thinking about things and seeing things and talking to family members back home that I'm not able to do. And as a result, I feel that the elders have something to learn from the young people, but they have some, maybe they have some methodology and some knowledge of sources and some of the, I think there is some wisdom from that our ancestors pass on to us, but it's not all the wisdom. I think there's more, I think that young people have new energy and new ideas, and so I'm hoping the association will become a forum for the exchange of these generational ideas. It's a great idea. I think there are youth issues that just youth have to face in terms of, dating or marrying or associating with people from other clans or other regions or something. But there's also issues that youth can address to help us. And your knowledge of the internet and of technology and so on is far more advanced than most of us, So there's a lot for you also in terms of collecting data that you can contribute. And just screening, seeing how poetry, for example, is changing on the web, and internet, because every Somali community is making its own poetry. What's going on, and that's always something that people like, and it tells you a lot about what's on people's minds when you read the poetry, right? And how and the language, how's the language adapting? Is it bringing in new words and so on? There's a lot of health areas, I have a lot of students at Penn who are interested in pre-health issues. You don't have to become a doctor, but you might be interested in educational, health education campaigns and so on. So there's a lot of ways in which young people can, I think, get involved, and maybe we could organize a series of networks of students interested in different things: international politics, gender and leadership issues. Preserving indigenous knowledge about the environment and so on, because Somalia has been transformed by 20 years of war and environmental exploitation, and so there's a lot of stuff that's going to be dying out unless we collect it. Young people can do that. They can help collect. You can learn from your relatives back home if you can get back to Somalia, or even the relatives, the old folks who have come in the diaspora, and talk to them about the old history, and I bet they'll be happy to tell the next, two generations now, here's what happened. Your parents are just talking about what happened to them. I want you to know what way things were like. And I think there'll be a lot of value to being systematic about collecting all the old stories, the community stories that people have, and family histories, and I think that'll be part of your young people's recovery of the past, and maybe appreciating it more, and then being able to move forward more confidently.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thanks.
Cheers.